Well, hello boys and girls. It's nice to see you again. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Mr. Mousey, Beyond the Silver Sea. Well, we've finished chapter 7 and now we're on to chapter 8. So let's just go straight into it and see what happens next. This chapter is called The Silver Sea. It took much longer than Mr. Mousey had imagined to reach the sea. Many more miles of land had to pass beneath them before they would catch even the distinct salty nip in the air. Meanwhile, the land below had changed from unwelcoming heath to much softer scenery. The forbidding wastes gave way to green hills and open meadows of grassland. Copses appeared of rowan and ash trees. Running below the hills, meandering in and around the woods, sparkling rivers traced their paths, and both animals enjoyed this part of the journey very much. Looking over the sides of their flying carpet, the world passed by without seeing the two in their passage. A shadow flitting by, a faint rustle in the wind, and they were gone. They had raised their altitude to 200 feet, as much to give them a better view as anything else, and looking down gave them the impression of gazing on an unreal world, like a fantasy in toyland. Of life below they could see none. Mr. Mousey thought once that he saw a thin tail of smoke rise from a valley near a little wood, and as he strained his eyes in that direction, he felt sure he saw movement beneath the trees. He caught a flash of red, but it was gone so quickly that Mr. Mousey couldn't be sure he had actually seen it. He was close to asking his friend if they might go back and take a closer look, but by this time he pondered this. He had lost sight of the would-be chimney and didn't bother mentioning it. Apart from that, the land below looked uninhabited. "Funny, isn't it?" spoke Mr. Rabbit after a while. "You mean that there's nobody about?" "Yes, I mean, down there it looks very like home. Maybe less trees, but you would expect to see folk about." Mr. Mousey nodded. Maybe it was just a place where nobody lived. Whatever the reason was, it was probably just as well that they were able to pass by unnoticed in any case. Far below them, in the small wood, a man sat by a campfire. He was dressed in black trousers and a dark blue tunic with gold rank markings on the shoulders and cuffs. A sword lay unbuckled beside the fire. His tent was won from a ship's survival store and was dyed red for visibility. As he looked into the flames and considered his next move, he detected a flicker or a shadow above him, and he moved out from the shade of the trees for a better look. Looking up, he imagined he may have seen something flit by, but he could not determine what it was. The shadow was quickly gone, however, and so, after a few minutes, he returned to his lonely camp and began to plan where next he should head. He had searched all this country and decided that his next direction should be south. Being separated from his men after the fight made things all the more difficult for him, and under his breath he vowed again that he would bring vengeance to those to whom it belonged. For the 100th time he prayed that the one for whom he searched still lived and was unharmed. The passing shadow was now far from his mind as he began to break camp and prepare to head south back to the sea. The smoke below and the movement in the trees was also now far from the mind of the mouse, as the carpet sped on far above and already several miles away from that campfire. After some time the woods and meadows passed by, and a flatter terrain unfolded below them. The trees petered out and reedy tracts replaced the meadows. Here and there sand dunes could be seen, and these occurred more and more until at last they were the main backdrop. It was now that the refreshing breeze of cooler air made itself felt, and before they knew it, the land fell behind them and they were flying over sea. Bringing the carpet down lower raised the temperature somewhat and also brought them to a sound neither had heard before. It was a sound like wind crashing and lifting itself to crash again. In between this was a rumbling and a swishing, a roar and a fizzling. The sea! Can you hear it? Cried the little mouse, feeling very small in such a gigantic background. Mr. Rabbit's eyes were wide in wonder. It had just never occurred to either animal that the sea would make sounds, or be so big. In a surprisingly short time, the land behind had disappeared to a long dark line on the horizon, and even this soon faded until the horizon, every direction they looked, was uniformly sea. Below them the late afternoon sun glinted in sparkles off the foaming waves, tossing themselves over and over, like ranks of vast armies marching with sunlight on their shields. Seabirds raced over their peaks and troughs, others wheeled and glided in the wind. Some cast themselves with careless abandon head first into the sea of silver, coming up seconds later with beaks grasping shining, glittery fishes. I thought the sea was just a big lump of water, whistled Mr. Rabbit. Seems a very busy kind of a place, actually. It's a lot bigger than I imagined, replied the mouse. In fact, I've never seen anything so big. How far do you think to the other side? Asked his friend. No idea, came the reply. Then, time for a spot of tea. Mr. Mousey laughed. I think any amount of it. So they adjusted their flying height to about 50 to 60 feet. They quite enjoyed feeling their speed as the waves raced by below them, and also it made the sea feel less oppressing by making it feel closer and therefore not so absolutely massive. Their packs were doing an excellent job of cutting out the wind, and huddled behind them was as near to warm as they were likely to get travelling through the sky in such a way. Until, that is, Mr. Mousey pulled out the 2 sleeping bags he had packed in his rucksack. In no time at all, each animal was very cosy indeed, snuggled up in the bags while they prepared their tea. Mr. Mousey was well into the food he had brought, but put together a very decent meal of fish and wheaten bread, followed by chocolate biscuits. Mr. Rabbit likewise had a good tea of fish and parsnip, along with butter biscuits and jam. Water had to do where a cup of tea would have just made it absolutely perfect. Feeling very much better, the afternoon turned into evening. Both animals curled up into their sleeping bags to take some rest. As the carpet maintained its steady course, the rabbit watched the sea pass by as he lay with his head upon a pillow of Mr. Mousey's little red and green scarf. The constant picture of waves passing and new ones appearing to pass as the others before had the effect of making the sleepy rabbit nod off and slip into a deep and untroubled sleep. Mr. Mousey stayed awake longer, and he used the time in pulling the book once again from its satchel and reading over the pages. Now, whether he had missed it the first time or it had only freshly appeared, he couldn't quite say, but he discovered a whole section concerning the flying carpet. The instructions printed under the carpet itself were repeated, but also a set of oral instructions. It seemed that there was more than one way to fly the carpet, and there were words that could be used in place of physical actions. Mr. Mousey took the time to read and memorize these words. There was also some other information. The carpet could not be used by anyone if its owner did not want it, and it could not be easily damaged unless by dragon fire. The last part got him to thinking again about the reason for their journey. It obviously was not without danger. They had found that much out already. But dragons? How much lay ahead? How would they rescue whoever or whatever was in danger? He turned back to the front of the book and read once more from the first chapter. In the book, they found, among other things, the way to the adventure ahead, the mission of rescue, the map of the journey, and the warnings of danger. The map of the journey, thought the mouse. Now where would that be? He turned through the pages more carefully than before, making sure not to miss any. He looked and he searched, but about the middle of the book, one of the chapters, chapter 11, was titled Directions. When he looked at the illustration on the left-hand side, it turned out to be a beautifully drawn and illustrated map. Now, how did I miss this before? He asked himself. He looked carefully at the page. At first, it was merely a jumble of names, rivers and mountains to him, but as he studied the map, he spotted something near to the top and to the right of the page. The woods, it said simply. It was a very small part of the map, and the artist had drawn in a few tiny trees to depict a wood and running through it a line of silver. Beside that line, it simply said river. River, mumbled Mr. Mousey aloud. That's the river. It seemed to make the world he knew so tiny in comparison to the rest of the world that up to now was just a vague, out there kind of a world. Now he saw that all that seemed to be so big, so real, so complete in his own mind was only a little corner in an artist's map. A corner that only referred to the river, so central in their lives, the river, as just river. Only one river among many, and a small one at that. However, he could now study the map with better understanding. He had a point of reference from which to make sense of the remainder of the map, and so he began to earnestly pore over it. Now the scale of the thing took a bit of getting adjusted to, for one thing. Whereas he had thought of the wildlands as being very far away from home, on this map they were a lot closer than actually looked safe. Starting just above and to the left of the tiny trees that were the woods, they ran down the west side of the river and opposite the trees, continuing on even when the woods on the east bank stopped. They were simply marked as heath and illustrated with a number of horizontal arcs representing hills. Below that, the odd tree appeared again, and the seemingly uninhabited land that they had flown over earlier in the day was marked as Dales, former domain of King Benes. A picture of a lion above a pair of crossed swords was drawn over the name King Benes. Below that again was marked salt marshes, and at last, the sea. Now this gave Mr. Mousey some idea of scale. The sea was easily 5 times as wide as the entire journey they had done from home to the salt marshes. Here and there islands broke up the unremitting expanse of water. Some were so small as to be dots on the page, but a couple were big enough to allow the woods to fit in 10 or 15 times. Near the bottom of the page, the sea came to the shores of a land marked with many mountains and forests. The shoreline wasn't even, but indented with a loch digging deep and south into its territory. Written over this terrain was the word Descalador. Descalador, mused the mouse. So we are headed for Descalador. It has a very far away sound to it. And what when we get there? As if in answer to this unspoken question, some pieces of paper slipped out from the bottom of the book. He managed to catch them before the wind carried them out to sea. The light was beginning to fade away fast as night claimed its place, and so Mr. Mousey had to hold the pieces of paper close to his face to make out what they were. They were the stamps that had come on the wrapping of the parcel when it had arrived at Mr. Rabbit's house. He had forgotten that they'd cut them off the brown paper and slipped them into the middle of the book back in the house. He looked again at the stamps and the illustrations on them. The green one with the castle and the forest was there, as was the red one with the fiery dragon. The pink one caught his attention most of all. It was the one showing the sad princess. "Are you the one we're coming to rescue, princess? Is it you who has called us and sent the book?" said Mr. Mousey aloud. Well, there was no way of answering these questions for now, so with the first stars breaking through the ever-deepening sky, Mr. Mousey closed the book and slipped it back into the satchel. He lay on his back, looking up into the revealed splendour of the universe above, and also listening to the snores of his friend. It was not long until his eyelids grew heavy, and he joined him in the world of dreams. While the two friends slept side by side on a carpet crossing miles of sea, the night crept by with nothing untoward. So far from land there was no one to note their passage. Shooting stars traced their paths above, and creatures of the deep called to their kind in unknown tongues, deep, deep below the invisible depths. Still the carpet carried them, without slowing, mile after mile, farther and farther than the place called home. The morning came in gradual revelation. First the blackness greyed, and then the sky brightened as the stars dimmed. Once again the eastern sky came afire with colour, and on the flying carpet two small creatures stirred in the dawning day. Mr. Mousey was awake first, but he lay on for a few minutes, enjoying the warmth of his bed and watching the world awaken to the day. This world included a certain rabbit who groaned and stretched where he lay. Morning already, he muttered between stretches. He had slept soundly all night and was taking a while to return to wakefulness. With eyes not quite half open, he pushed himself free of his sleeping bag and stood, arms above his head, in wide yawns. "Good morning," said the mouse from his side of the carpet. "How's you this morning?" yawned the rabbit. "Hungry. I think I'll nip into the kitchen and see what's for breakfast." With that, he took a couple of steps to the side, and with a fading "Wah!" promptly disappeared off the side of the carpet. Oh. Well, that's the end of that chapter, boys and girls. We'll have to wait till the next chapter to find out what happens. Goodbye. Keep safe. Thank you for joining me again today. Bye.